Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink, Friday, March 28th. 10 days now into the Darian DeVries era in Bloomington. Not a whole lot of news in terms of roster additions out there yet, but we're going to dig into some of the the topics that people are most interested in right now as it pertains to IU basketball with our guest today, Tony Adragna. Before we get to Tony, wanted to take a moment and remind you that Podcast on the Brink brought to you by our good friends at Visit Bloomington. Visit Bloomington is a proud partner of Podcast on the Brink and Indiana University Athletics. March Madness has officially kicked off and spring is about to begin. Catch the NCAA men's and women's tournaments while enjoying some award-winning wings at Buffalo's, go paddleboarding on Lake Lemon, or experience one of the many spring festivals in Bloomington, like the Cosmic Songwriter Festival and Grand Falloon. Order your free visitor guide and plan your spring getaway at visitbloomington.com. Was actually in Bloomington last week for the press conference, quieter than usual with spring break. It was alarming how little traffic there is when the students are away for break, but it's actually nice. And I know now why my chronic Hoosier loves his B-Town summers on Kirkwood, low crowds and a chance to get out and enjoy the city. But Tony, welcome back to Podcast on the Brink. It's been a while since we talked. Obviously, a lot has changed with the Indiana program. It was a longer than usual coaching search, just based on the circumstances of everything that went down. I think there was a time where people started to get a little bit antsy in terms of news, and obviously the search itself was kept pretty buttoned up. Just what were your immediate reaction when Indiana arrived where it did with Coach DeVries and that hire? Obviously, there were some twists and turns, different names that were thrown about, but I think the one thing that I keep coming back to is that really nobody knew anything the whole time. I mean, obviously there was some speculation. I know there was agents and things getting information out to certain people and a lot of chatter in the background, but Indiana ran a pretty buttoned up process. So I'm just kind of curious how you received the news, obviously that there was a new coach and who they landed on.
Yeah, I think, first of all, love coming on the podcast. Appreciate you having me on again, Alex. You know, the one thing that I've talked to people about is that it is very apparent that Scott Dolson will run very buttoned up searches. Because, you know, you look at the football search with Sig as well. Like, Sig wasn't really on the radar until the day that he was hired, or his at least announced hiring. Same with DeVries. You know, really was kind of one of those candidates that was seemingly in the background. Like, he was on some hot boards and things, but never really was the guy that people thought was going to take over the Indiana program. So, you know, hats off to Scott Dolson of really keeping these things buttoned up. You know, that's hard to do. Like you said, there's agents talking, there's people talking, there's seemingly a lot of people involved in these types of hires, and to keep everything so quiet essentially until things started leaking out the night before. But, you know, even then it was like, is this real or is it not? Because you just didn't know what was real in this search. So, I got to tip my cap to Scott Dolson and the seemingly very few people that were actually involved in this thing and really keeping things buttoned up. And to me, as a coach, like, that gives you a lot of confidence in your bosses, right? Like, you know, you're trying to keep those things under wraps as best you can. And by not getting those things leaked out there, like, to me, that would make me feel good as a coach coming into a new situation about the administration and the people that I'll be reporting to. So that was kind of my first reaction to things, was like, dang, another job well done by Dolson and crew. And then it was really, all right, let me dive into DeVries a little bit more because he wasn't really on the radar a ton. I didn't really see him being the IU coach, not because he wasn't qualified, not because I didn't think he was a good coach. It was more so, you know, there was a lot of other names that were kind of floating out there that I was diving into. So my first reaction was like, interesting hire. You know, let's dive into the nuts and bolts of it and kind of figure out why. And so then I dove into things pretty deeply. I released my video kind of on Darian DeVries and unfortunately I called him Darian DeVries in the video, which people let me know I mispronounced
To
it.
be fair, I didn't know how to say it either. I had to do some research as well
So
when the name was announced.
how I did my research was I went to his press conference of last year when he was announced as West Virginia's coach, and they announced him as Darren DeVries. So that was where I had my my
So they didn't even
pronunciation
know. Maybe
correct.
that's why I left after 1 year.
But so I released that video, and that really convinced me. Okay, here's the why of what Scott Dolson saw. Obviously, he saw it at a much grander level because he was had a lot of people doing a lot of analysis for him. But I dove into probably 7-8 hours of clips on West Virginia, looking at numbers, things like that. And then when Scott Dolson got up there and talked later that day, he kind of reaffirmed some of those things. Cutting edge offensively, team really plays hard. This coach is just a ball coach. Like he just wants to grind. They called him a grinder several different times. So to me, that was kind of my like 24-hour reaction period of getting the news to like letting it soak in and figuring out, the X's and O's of this, and why Scott Dolson went this direction.
So when you dug into the film, and I've watched your breakdown, and for those who haven't seen it, I think it's still pretty far up on your Twitter feed. If you go, I think you have to search back a little bit, but it's in there. You look at this stuff pretty regularly from just a film perspective with the stuff that you do with IU Film Room. What stood out just in terms of the stuff that he runs, and what is maybe going to be a big departure from what we've seen from Mike Woodson and Archie Miller?
Sure, yeah. I mean, the biggest thing to me is how he spaces the floor. Like that's been one thing that's been lacking in the Indiana program to me is opening the floor up a little bit, opening up driving lanes, moving the ball side to side. A lot of ball movement, making the defense move and shift. Screens off the ball a lot. That's not a lot, something that we saw a lot with Archie and Mike Woodson. So to me, it's how he spaces the floor, opens the floor up, gives his people concepts. They'll run sets and things like that, but a lot of it is just conceptual motion offense, teaching them where there's driving lanes, how to open up gaps and space for guys, and really just moving without the basketball and understanding how can I help the guy with the basketball with my gravity on the floor. So to me, that'll be the biggest thing is a lot of 5 out or even 4 out, 4 out, 1 in. And using that big, that's kind of the 1 in, still like screening away, not near the basket. Indiana, since Archie Miller, has been in the 90th percentile or higher in terms of the percentage of post ups, for 8 straight years. Like it's been post up basketball. That is not going to be what we see with Darian DeVries, or I'd be shocked if that's what we see with Darian DeVries. West Virginia this past season, they were in the 5th percentile in percentage of post ups. And so that is going to be a stark contrast for Indiana fans offensively because, for 8 years it's been pounding inside of Juwan Morgan, pounding inside of Trace Jackson Davis, getting inside to Khalil Ware and Malik Renew and Umar Ballo. Like, you go down the line, and that's been the focal point of Indiana's offense. And, I think as you watch these games in March, you see that guards are typically going to win you games in March. And Indiana really hasn't had a team built for that. And that's the proof's in the pudding and the results. So I think that is going to be a stark contrast from what we've seen in almost the last decade of Indiana basketball.
I know we're very early in the process in terms of the portal, and people are, I don't want to say impatient, but there's, I've heard from a lot of fans like when her name's going to start popping up. But without that, right now we're kind of left to speculate. But I'm curious, from watching the amount of film that you have, what are the traits in a big man that DeVries would want to bring into a program? Because we know it's not going to be a guy that they're going to throw the ball down into the post and like let him go to work as the 5 guys you mentioned. I mean, maybe not to the same extent Juwan Morgan, because he was able to step out a little bit, but the other names that you mentioned were all really back to the basket players. What and I think there was some people who maybe thought, well, fresh start, maybe Malik Renew comes back, or would like to have him back, and based on what you've described, it doesn't make a ton of sense for him to come back. Um, based on this offense, because he's going to be a guy obviously that needs the ball and wants the ball in the post, and he's a great talented post scorer, but maybe not the best fit for this new system. But what is it that he's going to be looking for based on what you've seen from his team at West Virginia? And I'm not sure how much you went back and looked at Drake, but what are the key factors to look for when they do add a big man?
Yeah, it's going to be somebody with versatility. They can move without the basketball. They can go set screens, and they're a good, solid screener. I mean, a lot of what he does on offense is predicated on setting good screens. And so, when I say that, I mean both on the ball and off the ball. He's going to run a lot of off ball actions for Tucker DeVries. And so you got to be able to set good screens, but then you also have to be able to operate and dribble handoffs. That's a big part of his offense is getting that ball kind of in the high post, letting that guy make decisions from there, that guy being the big man. And so somebody with versatility there, and then can catch lobs on the offensive end. Like, he's going to roll that guy to the rim a lot, but he's also going to slip them, or he's going to pop them and kind of create space that way as well. So it's somebody with versatility, but as you mentioned with Malik Renew, it's somebody that doesn't need the ball in their hands or a high usage. It's somebody that kind of understands their role in the team is, make shots around the rim when it's thrown to me and create things for other people with your gravity on the floor. So those are going to be kind of the traits he looks for offensively. Defensively, I think he's going to want somebody that can protect the rim. He's I know this is a cuss word for people, but he does employ the pack line defense. And, in the pack line, you're going to want somebody that can protect the rim, somebody that's got good, solid post defense, because you're going to double the post a lot in the pack line, and then you're going to have to sprint out and X out. So you're going to need to be versatile on that end as well. Last year at West Virginia, they didn't have a great big man presence. They lacked size, I thought, in the Big 12 especially, but they still fought tremendously hard on the defensive end. The big man's always your anchor of your defense, right? It's why, I know pack line kind of gets like to be the cuss word with Indiana fans because Archie Miller employed it, but like defense wasn't really Archie Miller's shortcoming. That was more so on the offensive end and getting guys that were dynamic on the recruiting trail that could actually win basketball games. So, Brad Stevens employed the pack line defense, so it's not this horrible system. And so I want people to be cognizant of that as well when they hear about pack line defense and not just freak out immediately. That I do think going back to your big man trait, though, you're going to want somebody that can guard multiple positions, perhaps, especially in the Big Ten. Like, you're going to have to be a grinder a little bit, and you got more of a big man play in the Big Ten than you are maybe nationally, but you also don't want to build your roster to win the Big Ten necessarily. You want to build your roster to be able to compete in March. And so, getting these big plotting guys may not be the best recipe to win the Big Ten each and every year, but it might be your best recipe to make some noise in March.
Yeah. The name that, just kind of looking back at the portal for last year, the name that kind of popped in my head immediately when you kind of mentioned some of the things you just did was Amari Williams, who ended up at Kentucky. That to me would be more of the prototypical big man that DeVries would look for, as opposed to an Umar Ballo or a Malik Renew. And that's nothing against those guys. It's just, I mean, Ballo before he came to Indiana wasn't necessarily your back to the basket player, but obviously in terms of just his mobility wasn't the greatest. But you watch a guy like Amari Williams, he can just do so many things. His versatility with the ball, that's the kind of player that I think basically fits the description of what you're describing. I want to go back a little bit into DeVries' history, and obviously some people looked at his season last year at West Virginia and said, well, he was 19-13. He was the first team out of the tournament. What's so impressive about this? He was just one spot ahead of Indiana. But a thing that a lot of people brought up was just how he elevated the Drake program, because it was really a long time between their 21 seasons. But, looking back in their history and what he was able to do just in terms of stacking those 21 seasons. How important is that, do you think, when evaluating a coach to go back? And I know this is something that Mike talked a lot about on the X's and Joe's podcast, but just being able to elevate a program to maybe a height that it wasn't at before. How pivotal, I guess, is that when evaluating candidates?
I think it's important. It kind of goes back to the Sig mold, right? He showed that could build a program, and turn it around in short order as well. And to me, that's your role as the head coach, right? You're the CEO. Like, you're making all of the things happen for your program to take steps forward. And that's not just knowing X's and O's. Like, that's understanding relationships and how to raise money, especially at programs like Drake and stuff like that, to elevate your facilities, would help elevate you in recruiting, and all of those things goes into being a head coach. And when you can do that at a program that historically was not good. And I think they had, what, 9 20-win seasons in their history of their school, and 6 of them were with DeVries or something along those lines. Hadn't made the NCAA tourney in several decades, and then all of a sudden, he's got them in the NCAA tournament regularly. Like, those things are important. And you know what I kind of got frustrated by when DeVries was hired is, all of a sudden, most people probably didn't watch a lot of Drake and West Virginia that are Indiana fans. Like, that makes a lot of sense. I don't either. And so what people immediately go to is they look at Ken Pom and Bart Torvik and go, well, his offense has never been top 20 offense, or, his defense wasn't great any given year or something like that. But those need to be contextualized, especially when you're looking at a mid-major program. Like, there's so much more that goes into it than just adjusted offensive efficiency and adjusted defensive efficiency. Those are important numbers, absolutely. And when you're at a Power 5 or Power 4 program, those do mean a little bit more, just based on who your opponents are and things like that. But, I've noted this in my video. Like, Dan Hurley didn't have a top 50 offense ever at Rhode Island. Now he's seen as one of the best offensive minds in the games, won back-to-back national championships. Like, those numbers just need contextualized a little bit. And so that was kind of my biggest, kind of annoyance with some fans when this hire was made, is they immediately just jumped to, all right, here were 3 numbers that weren't necessarily great on paper, but then when you dive into it and you look at film and you're like, my goodness, like, these guys are running awesome stuff. They're getting wide open shots. They're not hitting them. Like, sometimes your talent, is what it is. And like you mentioned, he elevated even a West Virginia program that the prior year was dead in the water, right? And immediately comes in, develops a staff, gets guys that can fit together. Unfortunately, he loses 2 of his top 3 scorers, and still has like I said, a 14th rated defense, and unless, if their president was the head of the NCAA selection committee, they're probably in the NCAA tournament. And so, those things are important. And so, I had some Purdue fans jabbing me like, when you have the opportunity to fire a guy that didn't make the tournament, to hire a guy that didn't make the tournament, you got to make that hire. And, it's like, there's so much to be contextualized in that hire. And that's why I love diving into the film side of things, because then you can kind of make nuts and bolts of it. And like, okay, I understand the why and the how kind of what these numbers are.
Yeah, you can go back and look at a lot of different coaches that have kind of moved up at level, and probably look at their Ken Pom profile or the numbers on Bart Torvik and say this wasn't all that impressive. But it kind of goes into maybe the next idea thing that I wanted to talk to you about, is just there's not many proven coaches that are going to move jobs, and so you have to kind of look under the radar. I'm not saying that DeVries was completely under the radar, but before he went to West Virginia, he was obviously just a mid-major coach, and looking at just raw numbers of offensive and defensive efficiency without any context, as you mentioned, it doesn't really tell the whole story, because when you're at a Drake, your ceiling for how high you can likely even get in those computer numbers is pretty limited because of the schedule that you're playing. Unless you go out in the non-conference and are just ultra aggressive and say you play 8 or 9 games against top 50 teams, which would be pretty stupid to do, because especially if you're trying to make the tournament, you only have a probably, you could maybe get the top 40, top 30. I think some of Dusty May's later teams at Florida Atlantic, and they may have scheduled more aggressively. I haven't looked at it closely, but they made their way up. But obviously, the one year he made a Final Four, and the following year they were really a ranked team all season. And so this idea that you have to hire a proven coach, I think Dan Hurley is a great example of this. No one was knocking down doors to hire Dan Hurley based on what he did at Rhode Island. He started out there really slowly and he gradually built over time. And another example of this, based in this year's tournament, Grant McCaslin. I mean, he was at North Texas, and I don't think before Texas Tech hired him, he would have even been a name that people looked at for moving up a level, and he's proven himself to be successful. So the everyone I think gravitates towards the idea of a TJ Otzelberger, or they gravitate towards the Brad Stevens or the Scott Drew, the Tommy Lloyd, all these names that are, but look at where most of them came from. They were in the kind of the same position that Darian DeVries is coming to Indiana. They had relatively little to no experience at the high major level, and they went into a program that committed to them, gave them the opportunity to move up, and eventually, if you're a good enough coach, you elevate the program with you.
Yeah, and I want to caveat this by saying, like, I understand where a lot of
No,
Indiana fans are coming
no,
from.
I get it too.
Yeah.
It's fun to dream about the home run hire, but realistically, how often does that happen? I mean, look at last
Right.
year with Pat Kelsey and Mark Pope. Where I mean, those guys had a combined 0 NCAA tournament wins when they were hired. That's unthinkable for programs like that to hire coaches like that.
Yeah, that's what's funny too is I got in a little bit of a back and forth, which I should honestly do less of on Twitter, but sometimes I can't help myself. With somebody that was like, I kind of mentioned the Hurley mold, and because they were mad that we hired DeVries. When I say we, I mean Indiana. And I was like, okay, well, you know, he was like, Dan Hurley had a much better winning percentage than DeVries did before he got the UConn job. It's like, that's absolutely false. DeVries has over a 70% win percentage. Hurley had 57% prior to going to UConn. And I'm not saying DeVries is going to be Dan Hurley. But that's part of Scott Dolson's job, right? Is projecting where can this guy take the program? How has he done things elsewhere? You know, what makes him special? Does he need something to make him special? Maybe you don't. Like maybe at Indiana, all you need is just somebody that coaches basketball, can get along with the donors, understands how to use the fan base to your advantage, and you don't have to be special. Like there is that possibility as well. You know, there's been guys that have gone far that aren't these crazy, you know, personalities or great, just the best X's and O's guys, but they understand just how to elevate people and they're good leaders. And, you know, for me, my biggest thing here with Darren DeVries is everything I've heard about him is the dude loves basketball. He's going to go out and grind on the recruiting trail. He's going to understand what it takes to make Indiana tick. I mean, a lot of people I've talked to that have had meetings with him already are important people in the state. And like it or not, like you got to get along with those people and you got to be able to talk to the top donors and you got to be able to talk to the common fan. Not that the fans are this end all be all and you have to be best friends with all of them, but as he noted in his press conference, like having a passionate fan base can certainly be used to your advantage. And just understanding that from the outset to me is why I'm confident this is a good hire. And then also having a guy that was at a great job in West Virginia. Like West Virginia is a really good job. They've got great support. They're like the professional team of the state. Everybody rallies around them. That's a good job. And the fact he was willing to leave that after 1 year to go take the Indiana job because he thinks he can do great things with Indiana, to me, you got to have a little bit of like, for lack of better terms, dog in you. Like to leave a good job after 1 year to go take a better one. And to me, like that mentality and that mindset is why I think this is not an Archie Miller hire. Like I don't think Archie Miller really ever wanted the Indiana job, but he just thought, how could you say no to Indiana? Whereas Darren DeVries, I think this is something like, hey, I want this. I think I can go do big things here at Indiana, and I'm going to leave this great job and these great people to go elevate a program that has a lot of history, and I think I can get it back to that. So that's what gives me a lot of confidence here in this hire.
Yeah, I mean, everyone talks about Indiana being a fishbowl, and the fans and the negativity, but if you don't have the passion from the fan base, what do you really have as a program? You have really nothing. I mean, that's what's really kept Indiana basketball um, relevant all these years is they've not won, but the fans continue to show up and support the program. And all of this, we talk about this every coaching hire. Indiana, I wouldn't call it a sleeping giant because obviously there's a lot of support anyway. But imagine what it would look like if you are the person that comes back to Indiana or comes to Indiana and gets it back to contending regularly in the Big Ten. And I don't even want to hear about national championship stuff because to me, like the number one thing for Indiana is just try to get in the top 3 or 4 in the Big Ten regularly, and then worry about the other stuff. That I mean, that was one of the things that Mike Woodson talked about from the beginning. Like, drove me nuts. It's like, did you not see the standings the last 4 years? You shouldn't even be talking about national championships. Just get back in the hunt in the Big Ten. But I agree with you. The idea that he is embracing the challenge and going back to Archie, looking back on it, he never really seemed comfortable with the idea of like being the Indiana coach. He just wanted to coach the team. There's a lot of other things that go into it. That's the one thing we'll see with DeVries, how when as time goes along here, how he embraces the other responsibilities of being the coach. I mean, he obviously handled the press conference really well. He didn't. It wasn't any like crazy charisma that he showed or anything like that, but he obviously met every question head on. But the things that he said, just in terms about his process and how he wants to build a program, build a culture, these are not really things that we definitely didn't hear from Mike Woodson, and we may have heard them early on from Archie Miller, but then we just heard less and less from him over time. So I think from a communication standpoint, he's off to a much better start as well.
Totally agree. And I got some people that are like, he seemed pretty dry. Is that the personality that can win at Indiana? And yes, absolutely. And what I think too is like he was dry in his prepared statement. Like he obviously wasn't very comfortable in giving that. As soon as the questions came and he was talking off the cuff just about basketball and how he wants to lead a program and that weren't things that were prepared, like those were, to me, that was his better side of the press conference when he didn't have to, thank all the right people and just try to say all the right things to get people going. It was when he got the questions from you guys in the media and he could just talk shop and how he wants to build a program and how he's going to run his offense and his defense. And like, to me, that's like the charisma side of it and how you can sell, because that's when you're in the room with parents and kids and agents and all those things. Like, how do you sell your vision and your team to get them to buy in what you're doing to what you're doing? And he did that extremely well at the press conference. Like, here's what I'm going to do. He laid out a very clear, coherent plan. And then, when he's in that room with the kids, he's going to obviously do that at a deeper level. And like, that's what people want. They want to see your vision and then you get them to buy into that vision. And I think he's going to have that. It reminds me a lot of Sig and kind of how he talks about building culture, staying process oriented, not worrying about the results, being very cognizant of culture and not letting the wrong people in. To me, that's people have been like, Indiana's not attached to anybody in the portal. And it's like, well, if you want desperation and to just continually just have your name attached to every guy in the portal, then like, let's go flashback to last year or the last couple of years. Like that's not necessarily what you want. He talked about, I'm going to build a team where the pieces fit together. Whereas under Mike Woodson, it was accumulating talent and then let's figure it out. And as we could have seen the last couple of years in Indiana, they couldn't really ever mesh and figure it out because the pieces just didn't fit. And so the fact that Indiana's not attached to every guy in the portal and they're being very kind of cognizant of here's the pieces we want and we're not going to deviate from that process and that plan. And the fact that all the best players are still playing as well. So it's like, everybody available right now are all the guys that lost. Not that you can't get guys that have lost or mid-major guys or whatever, but I do think that there's a very clear plan. And it's very similar to what kind of Sig did with the football program of like, we're not going to sacrifice things in year one to kind of go away from our standards. Like, we're going to have these standards. And if we don't win a national championship in year one, but it's giving us a solid foundation to build upon, like that's what you want as a program. And so that's what I'm kind of excited to see is like, what's this foundation going to be? And how are they going to build it and how are these pieces going to fit together? And then what I'm also excited about is it seems as though they're going to go do a Euro trip this summer. So we'll kind of get a glimpse of what those pieces look like a little bit earlier than some previous seasons.
I hope we can get some television coverage for that if it does happen, because I know the last couple of times I know when Kentucky takes these trips, it's like a big deal. Like the SEC network is there covering the games, which is I think a great way to showcase your program. And I know the Montreal trip because I went on that trip back in 2014. It was I went to it was 5 exhibition games. We were allowed to show 2 minutes of video from all the games, and it's like what are we hiding here in August? And I know the last time they went, it was I think 2021, the Bahamas. It was the same thing because I got somebody down there to take videos. Like we can show 2 minutes. I'm like, these are exhibition games. Like do everything you can to promote your program and try to get as much out there. I mean, it's a way to build excitement for the program. So I hope that's something that changes for that. I want to go back to the portal though for 1 second. Last year, I think a lot of us, myself included, other people in the media, got caught up in the portal rankings where guys were ranked. Miles Rice was the whatever top 5 point guard in the portal. Kanan Carlisle was a top 50 player in the portal. Umar Bala was the center everybody wanted, and we talked. A lot of us talked ourselves into just grabbing all these players that are talented, figuring out later. But Indiana's going to have talent. That's what we heard all season, right? Indiana's got talent. They can make a run, but the pieces didn't necessarily fit together. So you mentioned kind of the lack of information right now in terms of being connected to portal guys, and I think some of that is the fact that there's not a full staff in place yet, and also that this for those that don't follow me on social media, I put out a timeline yesterday that I talked to my friend Dylan Burkhardt of UM Hoops of Dusty May was hired kind of a similar time frame last spring, and when they started getting commitments wasn't until the back half of April. So even though it may feel like things are a little behind schedule or moving slowly, it's really still early. I mean, it's what day 5 of the portal, and it's a 30-day window, and guys don't have to be committed by the time the portal closes. They just have to be in the portal. And I think you made a great point. The guys that are in the portal right now, unless you've left a team that's still playing, which I think there's a couple
So
of
that's a red
examples of
flag.
that. Maybe, yeah, right. There's a couple of examples of that, but sure, there's going to be great players out there, but there's probably a couple of players maybe that are still playing right now that Indiana wants to get for next season that are going to go in the portal. What do you think, just from a fan perspective, when you follow this whole process? What are you going to be looking for, just in terms of fit and style of play when you evaluate these portal guys?
Yeah, I think it's going to be huge, and it'll be fun to see kind of, obviously DeVries has been a little bit hamstrung everywhere he's been thus far. Like at Drake, obviously you're not going to get 5-star, 4-star talent. Then at West Virginia last year, you're building a new roster. It's not like they have good NIL, but it's not like you have great NIL. So to me, it'll be really interesting to see, like, this would be the first time DeVries could probably go out and build a roster I don't want to say the perfect roster for what he wants, but pretty close to like his ideal scenario of how you build a team. And so to me, it'll kind of be really interesting to see what that means and how that projects moving forward for his tenure. Now, it's going to be a little bit more difficult because he's trying to get 12, 13 guys rostered, right? So it may not be his perfect ideal team in year one, but I think he's going to be able to get the prototypes he want at each position. Like point guard, I'm guessing he's going to want somebody like a Javon Small was at West Virginia. Somebody that can play two ways, very dynamic with the basketball in their hands, makes great decisions, can put the ball in the bucket, and then is kind of the head of the snake of the defense, applies great ball pressure, and just takes the offense out of what they want to do. So point guard wise, that's what I'm guessing he's going to try to go get, especially since he had so much success with Small. Then he's going to want dynamic wings, guys that can play multiple positions, probably 2 through 4, can guard multiple positions and put the ball in the bucket, right? But it sounds like common sense, but that's likely what he's want to go get. His son's going to be more of that stretch 4 mold, so he might try to get somebody that's more dynamic at the 4, that he can plug in, off the bench, somebody kind of like a Caleb Banks prototype, long, athletic, like I said, can guard multiple positions and things like that. And then we talked about the big man, kind of having some length and athleticism to him. But maybe off the bench, he'll try to get somebody that's a little bit more like your typical five of just kind of big, strong, can play in the post because you know you're going to be grinding through the Big Ten against a lot of really good post players. So you might want to go get somebody off the bench that can kind of complement what your other big is doing. So to me, it'll be really fascinating to see what he goes and gets. And then I think what you're going to see more than anything is he's not going to sacrifice the team to go get a five-star talent or something like that. Like his teams play extremely hard. Like they just do. I went and watched a lot of West Virginia film. Like didn't have a ton of talent, especially as the year wore down and they lost guys to injury, but they just played so hard. His Drake team played extremely hard. So he's going to go get guys, I think, that are going to give it everything they've got on the floor when they're out there. They're guys that aren't afraid to kind of sink their teeth in on the defensive end and get stops and things like that. So to me, it'll be really interesting to see kind of like the prototypes at each position that he's targeting, because I do think it's going to be pretty dissimilar to what we've seen at Indiana for quite some time.
Yeah, the other thing I'm potentially excited to see is there maybe a couple freshmen that you could go out and get to kind of, because you're filling so many spots. I don't know that you want to go completely with all. I mean, let's say right now DeVries is on the roster. Who knows what happens with Luke Goody, but and Trent Sisley. So there's one freshman, but if you're gonna, and again, people are, well, there's 15 spots. I don't know that you're gonna fill that many spots. I mean, that's a good way to not have a great locker room if you're gonna bring in 15 scholarship players. I don't necessarily think that's the way to do it. Although, um, maybe you bring in a couple of freshmen that are longer term development guys. Again, you got to get the right um player with the right mindset, because the problem there is you bring a guy in, don't play him very much, and then they just hit the portal, so it's like a wasted year. But I think one thing you can learn from Matt Painter and his program at Purdue, he's been able to sell that vision on a longer term timeline for a lot of these guys, and it works, right? Because you bring a guy in and you develop them over a course of a couple of years, and all of a sudden, like a Trey Kaufman Wren, uh, most programs would have lost him after a year or two because he's redshirting, he's not playing, and all of a sudden he's still alive in the NCAA tournament and scoring 15, 17, 18 points a game regularly. So that would be another thing that's kind of interesting to me, because I don't think you want to get yourself in a situation where you have just all portal guys that are going to be, but a lot of them will be seniors, and you want to have some guys at least you can build some continuity year over year. That was one thing that stood out from what he said in the program, in the press conference, is just basically trying to make the experience so that you're not losing a ton of guys every year, because I don't think any coach wants to go through what this will be the second straight year for him of building from the ground up. I don't think that's a sustainable system for the long term.
Yeah, and it's hard. It makes your life extremely hard, especially when you're in the spring. Like that's a big time for development. But when you're having to focus all of your energy on building a roster each year, you kind of lose out on that. And then, like for him, it's really weird. Like they're not running spring workouts right now because they don't have a team. And it's not like those guys can just show up in March. Like they're at their previous universities until summer hits. So he's got nothing more to do right now than obviously dive into the portal and getting his staff aligned and things like that. But it's just such a different time where you don't have literally a single guy possibly returning. And so like you don't have anybody to work out. Like,
I mean, his son, that's it, right?
Yeah. And I've heard that like the guys that are in the portal are still allowed to like use the facilities and things like that to work out themselves and things like that. But, yeah, just a very weird, like I can't imagine any coach ever thought they would ever have to do that once, even a decade ago. And now that, now he's on his second straight year of having to do something similar to this. And so very interesting. I don't know that it's great for college basketball that so many teams are turning over their entire rosters year in and year out. But I do think as Indiana fans, it's kind of a nice cleanse a bit of just like putting the past in the past and kind of a renewed future of just all new, seemingly all new staff, seemingly all new players. Like everything's different. And I think just a program reset is probably healthy for everybody involved. And so I think there should be a lot of like optimism around the program right now. I think with just everything kind of being fresh and new, you're not thinking like, will this guy work out? Like he wasn't very good last year and thing like that. It's like, nope, all new. Everything's looking forward to the future. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing for where Indiana's at right now.
Yep. Well, Tony, thanks for carving out the time for us on this Friday morning. Always good to talk to you. As I said earlier in the show, everyone that hasn't watched your video breakdown on Darian DeVries over on is the best place to do that?
You can
Still
do
on
it X or it's on YouTube as well. If you just type in Darian
Okay.
DeVries breakdown, it's on there as well.
Okay, make sure to check that out if you haven't. Tony, again, thanks for coming on the show. Thanks, everybody, as always, for listening to Podcast on the Brink. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a rating and a review over on Apple Podcasts. Leave us a 5-star rating on Spotify, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.